On a bright, sunny day, high school students walked into the yard. In a noisy cafeteria, a long line of people waited to get their lunch. A chubby friend carried a food tray over to the table, trying to wake Gavin Clark from his doze. The kind friend nudged Gavin to wake up and eat, telling him he'd brought the food. Seeing Gavin still fast asleep, his friend sighed, guessing the boy must have been completely wiped out from staying up late chatting with Xania Scott. Gavin slowly opened his eyes, still feeling dizzy, and wondered where he was while a wonderful smell filled his nose. His eyes locked onto the fancy food tray before him, and in shock that it was just rice and other dishes, he suddenly jumped up and lunged forward with a wild look, startling a nearby girl. Gavin pressed his hands against the table, staring at the two meals with wide, hungry eyes that made his friend nervous. Gavin didn't wait a second to grab a drumstick, and then tore into it like a starving animal. His friend Yaniel Parker shouted anxiously, begging Gavin to eat slower so he wouldn't choke. Yaniel saw the scene and angrily leapt to his feet, yelling that it was his meal. Once Gavin had cleared both food trays, he let out a happy sigh, rubbed his full belly, and whispered that he had truly come back. He stood frozen, unable to believe the truth. He had truly been reborn. Yaniel looked around in a daze, grumbling to Gavin that he was so hungry he'd eat his own plate and still want more. Gavin quietly confirmed that he really was reborn as a hungry ghost. He stared with cold eyes and said that in his past life, he froze to death during a terrible ice storm. Yaniel stood frozen in shock, frantically asking what was wrong and wondering if Zia had left Gavin. Gavin tapped his friend on the shoulder to cut him off. Gavin looked grim as he called out Yaniel Parker's name, telling him it was wonderful to be alive again and that they could finally start over to get everything back. Yaniel Parker grumbled at Gavin to stop acting so creepy, making it clear he was very much alive. Gavin quickly grabbed his friend's shoulders and begged for the date, but Yaniel just stared blankly and said it was August 8th, 2024. Gavin pictured a frozen future in his mind, warning that the world would freeze to minus 50 degrees in just 2 weeks. Yaniel couldn't believe his friend was talking nonsense in the sweltering 40-degree heat, so he worriedly asked if Gavin was in trouble and promised to help him sort it out. Gavin turned away, showing he really needed help, and Yaniel, knowing him so well, happily stepped up to help. Gavin instantly spun around and asked for $1 billion, making Yaniel spit out his water in shock. Yaniel stuttered to ask if Gavin was really serious, but his friend gave a firm yes. Yaniel shook his head, insisting that $1 billion was so huge that selling his own dad wouldn't even come close to covering it. Gavin shot back asking what price Yaniel's father could fetch, only to hear an awkward answer that he'd sell for no more than $500 million. Gavin scolded Yaniel for selling his own father, which made his friend so angry at the ridiculousness that he just couldn't hold back. Just then, a couple walked by, and the blonde man named Zach whispered to the red-haired girl, Xania, that he had booked her a private room. Gavin and Yaniel's eyes instantly locked onto the brand-new couple who had just shown up. Zach quietly promised Xenia a private movie date, and she flirted right back. Yaniel frantically shouted to Gavin that Xenia Scott was cheating with Zach Young, the young boss of the Vast Dragon Group. Gavin and Yaniel stepped right in front of the couple, making the air feel heavy with tension. Xenia's face went pale, and her hands started to shake when she suddenly spotted Gavin, having been caught in the act. Yaniel's anger boiled over as he shouted at Xenia, furious that she betrayed Gavin after all he had given up for her. But Xenia just crossed her arms, smiled with a stubborn look, and calmly admitted that everything Gavin saw was exactly right. Sudden waves of painful memories from his past life crashed into Gavin's mind, showing him how Xenia betrayed him again and again, finally leaving him to starve to death. As Yaniel pushed his friend to run away, Gavin stayed cool as a cucumber, smiling and saying there was no hurry at all. Yaniel Parker shouted in anger, confused that Gavin would stay around Xenia when she made him feel so sick. Zach Young slipped his arm around Xenia and sneered at Gavin, calling him an annoying lovesick fool like a dung beetle, while Xenia bluntly added that Gavin's past actions were nothing but disgusting harassment. Gavin cut her off coldly and asked, "Are you finished talking?" As Zach kept trying to push her away, Xenia held on tight, declaring that no matter how Gavin knelt, she only cared about Zach, who was her true soulmate. Yaniel begged his friend to run away before he would be humiliated, but Gavin just asked for 5 more minutes. Yaniel stared at his stubborn friend and couldn't understand why someone as kind as Gavin couldn't see the real Xenia. Hearing that, Zach laughed and said that if Gavin could keep them entertained for 5 minutes, he'd reward him with a used piece of toilet paper. Suddenly, a loud crack filled the air as Gavin landed the first blow, leaving everyone stunned. Xenia screamed Zach's name in pure terror as her ex-boyfriend suddenly did something that left her heartbroken. Yaniel and the students around her were left speechless and unable to believe what had just happened. So Zach, clutching his red cheek, glared angrily at Gavin and growled that he dared to hit him. He threw himself forward in a wild frenzy, screaming that he would kill Gavin, who just stood there calm and still. Gavin didn't even have to dodge. He just kicked Zach right in the face with a loud thud and screamed at him scram. Yaniel broke into a cold sweat, completely shocked by the terrifying power his friend had just shown. As Zach hit the floor face first, Xania sprinted over to check on him and glare at Gavin for touching the dragon group, but Zach just shoved her away. Confident in his fighting skills, Zach lunged forward to strike, shouting that he was a Taekwondo black belt. Gavin stepped in to stop the attack, then hit Zach hard in the face while sneering that he was nothing but trash. Gavin stood over his unconscious rival and thought that thanks to the survival skills he learned during the apocalypse, taking down a braggart like Zach was nothing more than a breeze. Yaniel was so shocked he couldn't believe what he saw, so he asked Gavin when he had become this cool. While Xania Scott knelt by the unconscious Zach Young, she screamed at Gavin that he was a savage and warned him he'd soon regret his actions. She rose to her feet, jabbed a finger right at Gavin, and demanded he get down on one knee and say sorry to Zach, or she'd never let him forget it. Gavin slapped Xania hard across the face and coldly asked her who she thought she was. With a fierce glare, Zach Young pushed himself up and vowed to smash Gavin like a bug with whatever he had left. Gavin immediately silenced his threat by landing a hard punch to the stomach that made him cough up blood. Seeing Zach fall, Gavin grabbed a spray bottle from his pocket and grinned, "Glad I found this," while Zach scrambled forward, screaming for him to give it back. Gavin tossed the spray bottle into the air and sneered at Zach, daring him to feel sorry for the girls he'd hurt with it. The crazy young master lunged forward in a rage, shouting that Gavin had to hand the item back even though he denied everything. Gavin didn't hesitate, spraying the chemical from the bottle straight into Zach's face and making him scream in terror that Gavin had gone crazy. Zach grabbed his head and screamed in agony while Xania stood behind him, confused by what she saw. As Xania stepped forward with a trembling heart, Zach, having lost all control, threw her back and screamed for her to stay away. Zach's eyes were bloodshot and pinched tight, showing that his mind had completely given up. Zach snarled like a wild beast and charged straight at Xenia, knocking away the students around them. He seized Xenia's dress and ripped it apart with such force that the fabric tore violently. Xenia was so scared she'd beg Zach to stop, but they were right in the middle of the cafeteria. Zach tore away from her pleas and kept acting like a wild animal, making Xenia scream for help. In the middle of the chaos, Gavin calmly put a hand on Yaniel's shoulder, told him 5 minutes were up and it was time to go, and walked away, leaving his confused best friend behind. He raised the spray bottle, noting it was a strong aphrodisiac that Zach often used to hurt others, so this time Gavin was just letting him taste his own medicine. Gavin calmly assured Yaniel that Zach would never dare call the police on his secret weapon. He smirked, convinced that Zach, carrying the weight of an heir, would rush forward to seek revenge on his own. Yaniel gave a thoughtful nod, realizing that because of how Zach is, he'd just want to sort things out with Gavin on his own. The two walked out of the chaotic cafeteria together, with Yaniel curiously asking where they were going next. Gavin spun around, beaming with pride as he boldly announced his crazy plan to sell the house. They rushed to the real estate office, where Yaniel could only stare in shock and whisper his friend's name. Even though Yaniel frantically begged his parents to let him keep their only precious memory, Gavin refused to back down and signed the contract without a second thought. Deep inside, he knew exactly how to spend his $3.1 million to buy supplies and get ready for the coming ice disaster. After finishing the task with the woman, Gavin took his papers calmly, even though Yaniel still didn't understand how he had rushed into things. As Gavin hurried them out of the office toward their next stop, Yaniel was left completely bewildered. Gavin grinned with excitement and announced that his next move was to just start spending money. They were heading to a huge supermarket where Gavin was ready to start his big plan of gathering supplies. He didn't hesitate to ask the staff for 1,000 bags of rice, flour, and cooking oil each. He didn't stop there, but ordered 10,000 cans of every kind of food. The female supermarket worker stood frozen, shaking her head in disbelief at the huge order before she had to double-check it. Gavin crossed his arms and nodded, while Yaniel stared in shock, wondering if his friend was secretly buying enough food to run a whole grocery store. Gavin asked about delivery, and the woman smiled, promising they could handle just about anything. Gavin turned to Yaniel and asked about his family's empty warehouse in the suburbs, which suddenly made Yaniel understand what his friend really wanted. He put an arm around his best friend and promised to take over the warehouse so they could keep shopping even harder. Suddenly, 2 female classmates spotted Gavin and started mocking him, sarcastically mentioning how Xenia had cheated on him while also making fun of his lack of money. The woman beamed with joy. They couldn't believe that a broke man like Gavin could spend hundreds of thousands on such fancy things. Without stopping, Gavin kept pointing and ordering every device and thermal jacket to be packed, while the purple-haired girl stared in horror, realizing Gavin had already spent over $1 million. In a flash, she realized Gavin was just a rich young master in disguise, making this the perfect chance to seize. While Gavin felt ready, the girl with purple hair moved closer without making a sound. A sweet voice called his name, and Gavin's eyes sparkled brightly in response. Now the two girls started complimenting Gavin on how he looked. Dark memories from his past life flooded back, reminding Gavin that the men who stole from him and left him to freeze in the cold were Sharon Zeller and Jolene Little. Sharon kept trying to get Gavin to eat and break the heavy quiet between them. Gavin smiled warmly, nodded in agreement, and told Yaniel to take the items home first since he needed to handle something else. Thinking their prey had taken a bait, Sharon and Jolene dropped their masks and gleefully plotted to run away from Gavin at a fancy restaurant. Gavin happily linked his arms with them both, acting like a hungry fool, just waiting to be led away. They walked up to a towering building that stood tall, rich, and very expensive. Sharon and Jolene kept praising the restaurant and pushing Gavin to rush inside so he could show off his status. In the grand hall, one of the two girls turned to Gavin and asked if he liked the food. Gavin held the menu with a mysterious smile and casually asked if it wasn't too pricey. When Gavin asked, Jolene Little and Sharon Zeller laughed right away, claiming nothing was too pricey and threatening to just order whatever they wanted if he wouldn't. Jolene wasted no time and ordered the fanciest things on the menu, like black and gold caviar, rare M12 Wagyu beef, and Antarctic lobster. An hour later, Sharon Zeller sat surrounded by a table of empty plates, happily shouting that it had been ages since she'd eaten so well. When Sharon asked, Gavin stood up and told her the food was great before needing to step out for a moment. Gavin marched straight up to the fancy restaurant's front desk. Instead of paying his $18,800 bill, he shocked the female employee by asking her to prepare 100 identical banquet tables for him to pick up in just 10 days. The stunned receptionist dropped her jaw and stuttered as she asked if he was really sure about such a huge order. Gavin calmly slid a shiny gold VIP card across the table to show he had the cash ready. Remembering the endless days of eating canned food until he was sick, he decided to stockpile these banquets to keep his life going. Meanwhile, Jolene and Sharon watched Gavin walk away, secretly calling him a foolish rich fool and plotting to trick him into more shopping. The receptionist walked back to your table, beaming with news that the 100 banquet tables were finally confirmed, before softly reminding you to pay the check for your meal. Gavin coolly threw the card to the staff and made it clear that the two girls would have to pay their own way. He grinned with satisfaction, knowing the house sale money was nearly spent and it was time to look for loans. Right away, Gavin pulled up a lending site on his phone. He told himself he had no choice but to keep going, and after pulling out $2.7 million from 36 different platforms, he saw even more places to break into. Suddenly, his phone rang, and the screen flashed with the name Sharon Zeller. Far away, Sharon screamed angrily to find Gavin while Jolene and the restaurant workers waited patiently behind her. Gavin just smiled, told a casual lie about having to rush home for something urgent, and went on his way. He laughed with a cheeky grin and hung up by asking why I should pay. On the other end, Sharon Zeller let out a furious scream, demanding to know why Gavin hadn't paid for the meal he had asked them to join. Gavin Clark casually shot back, revealing that the two girls had dragged him there and ordered the priciest dishes themselves. Sharon was so stunned she couldn't speak, only stammering to ask if Gavin really wanted her and Jolene Little to pay that huge bill. Gavin just laughed and said he'd warn them, but they still picked the fanciest things on purpose. With nowhere to run, Sharon snapped and started calling Gavin a broke loser who had more pride than sense. But Gavin's phone call left her speechless when he told her to check with the staff about the 100 identical banquet tables he'd ordered, and the receptionist smiled as she confirmed it. Sharon's face instantly softened into a desperate plea, begging Gavin to come back and pay, convinced he simply couldn't be too broke to afford such a tiny meal. Gavin clicked his phone shut with a cold glare, refusing to waste his time on anyone he called a rotten fool. When a receptionist told him the restaurant didn't take credit cards, Sharon and Jolene panicked instantly. Rage surged through Sharon, making her snap and call Hunter to show Gavin a lesson he'd never forget. Meanwhile, Gavin stood in front of a lottery ticket seller, with a new plan forming in his mind. He smiled with confidence, remembering how he once won a huge prize at this very moment in his past. Gavin clutched the brand new lottery ticket, knowing he only needed to wait 2 more days for his fortune to explode. He went back to the warehouse and called his close friend Yaniel Parker, who was sitting tiredly on the floor. Yaniel complained that his friend left him to eat fancy food alone, but Gavin just smiled and promised an exciting night out instead. Standing in the warehouse full of goods, Yananiel couldn't understand why Gavin was throwing money away on them. Gavin spoke with great seriousness about how these items would save lives when the ice apocalypse came, and he earnestly begged his friend to trust him. Yananiel let out a strange laugh, admitting he couldn't believe the crazy story, while Gavin just smiled meaningfully and confidently, saying there was no need to rush because Yananiel would have to believe him in just a few more days. As Gavin Clark and Yananiel Parker stepped out of the warehouse, a gang of thugs stood in their way, with a leader staring Gavin down to confirm his identity. Gavin quietly admitted it, while guessing that they were just working for Hunter Walsh. The bald thug swung the bat, laughing at Gavin for daring to touch Hunter's woman like he was just some poor student. Freaking out over what was happening, Yananiel rushed to step in and warned them he was calling the cops. The bald thug and the blonde guy just laughed, daring them to break their legs before the cops could show up. But Gavin smiled and held back his friend, telling him to leave the police alone. The thugs thought he was scared and laughed, saying his call would be useless. Desperate, Yananiel tried to bargain by reminding them he was the son of the building materials store owner. The bald-headed thug glanced at the Parker heir, turned his nose up at him, and declared that Gavin Clark was the only one they were after today. Yananiel screamed for Gavin to run while he stayed behind to hold them off. The blond man shoved Yananiel out of the way, just as the bald thug roared and swung his bat straight at Gavin's head. Yananiel could only scream his friend's name in sheer terror. Gavin slipped past the hit with a laugh, calling the swing too slow and poorly done. Right away, he stomped the bald bad guy's belly so hard that the bat flew right out of his hands. The thug spat out blood, shocked by what he had just seen. Gavin grabbed the bat and swung hard at the thug's face before he could even say a single curse word. The club slammed hard into the bald man's mouth, smashing all his teeth. The leftover henchman stood frozen in shock, terrified by how fiercely this young teenager had just fought. Gavin grinned, tossed the bat over his shoulder, and dared them to all charge at him at the same time. The blonde bully got so mad at Gavin's challenge that he roared, screaming for his friends to rush in and kill him. Gavin just grinned with excitement, swinging his baseball bat to easily knock out the whole group. Yananiel Parker stood frozen in shock as his gentle friend faced down 6 thugs alone, only for Gavin to coldly ask if they had surrendered once the others lay defeated. Right after, he held out his phone and demanded that everyone send him $100,000. When the blonde guy called it extortion, Gavin stayed silent and shoved the stick hard into his belly. He clenched his jaw and warned that since they started the trouble, they would pay the price by having all 3 of their legs broken. Right away, Gavin's account lit up with a message saying $600,000 had just been added. He told himself he wasn't being cruel, but just thinking like a student who had already died in the long, dark aftermath of the apocalypse. Gavin draped his arm around the still stunned Yananiel, vowing to lead him somewhere truly amazing. They walked into a fancy nightclub where bright lights sparkled and dancers moved to the beat. Yananiel couldn't stop smiling as he shouted that this lively spot was the perfect place to blow off steam. Gavin walked straight to the bar and told the woman he was there to drop off some stuff for her boss. 2 were pushed down a dark inner hallway where dozens of scary guards in black suits stood watch. Yananiel shook with fear, stammering to ask if this was the interesting place Gavin had talked about, while his friend just gave him a mysterious smile. Yananiel screamed in a panic, claiming his heart felt like it was about to burst from fear and demanding to know why Gavin was there. Suddenly, the bodyguard bowed to an old man with silver hair who had just arrived and was respectfully called Mr. Lowe. Mr. Lowe squinted at Gavin and asked in a deep voice if he was there to deliver goods, since he had never met him before. Gavin smiled with surety, noting this was their first time meeting and explaining that he had rushed over right after learning Mr. Lowe was taking goods. Mr. Lowe squinted with doubt, wondering how 2 teens with nothing in their hands could have any goods to sell. Gavin calmly said they were the merchandise, which made Mr. Lowe laugh so hard because he had never met anyone willing to sell themselves like that. The smile disappeared, and Mr. Lowe growled, barking an order for his armed men to grab them both. With a gun pointed at him, Yananiel Parker froze in terror and quickly bragged about his dad's past, praying for his life. As Yananiel screamed in panic about what was going on, Gavin quietly told him that Mr. Lowe was a man who sold human organs. Yananiel let out a terrified scream, completely bewildered that Gavin could stay so calm while they were about to have their organs taken out. Gavin turned his back on his friend and challenged Mr. Lowe, daring the notorious kingpin to buy their goods. When challenged, Mr. Lowe roared that he would buy anything and everything, so Gavin immediately asked for $10 million for his whole body. Mr. Lowe coldly offered just $5 million, claiming the market was frozen tight because of the heavy crackdowns. Gavin said yes to one thing. He'd take the money now, drop off the goods in 3 days, and seal the deal with a firm handshake. Right after that, Mr. Lowe told his helper to bring over a slavery contract and forced them to sign it. Seeing just one contract, Gavin insisted on getting another copy, even though Yaniel was frantically waving his hands to say no. Gavin coldly waved away Yananiel's protests and told the bodyguard that he was selling too. The impatient subordinate shoved the cold gun right up to Yaniel's head and growled that he had to sign. The moment they escaped the lion's den, Yaniel erupted in fury, screaming that Gavin wasn't human anymore for betraying his friend. Gavin just waved it away as nothing, while Yaniel screamed that Mr. Lowe was a cruel gang leader who would tear them apart. Gavin's eyes went cold as he swore that the inhuman monster, Mr. Lowe, would be dead within 3 days. When Yananiel doubted facing an armed man, Gavin just smiled and promised to show him the coming apocalypse. The view opened up to a grand villa, where a voice asked if the gentleman was truly sure he only wanted to rent it. To the real estate agent's surprise, Gavin Clark stood his ground and insisted he only wanted to rent that specific villa. Yanel Parker folded his arms and questioned why they needed a villa right now, while Gavin just smiled mysteriously and whispered that something wonderful was waiting inside. He remembered how this villa was once his last safe haven, the place where humanity fell to its lowest point and where he finally lost his life. Gavin stared ahead with fierce determination, knowing his fresh start would begin exactly where he had crashed. When the agent said the owner wasn't renting, Gavin jumped in and offered to pay double just to get it. The agent said the money wasn't the problem, but Gavin immediately doubled the price 4 times over. He closed the deal right then, promising to pay 10 times the monthly rent with cash in hand. The female agent's eyes sparkled with joy at the huge sum, and she promised to do whatever it took to help Gavin rent the house. All Gavin asked for was permission to fix up the whole house, and the agent said yes right away. Suddenly, Gavin heard a woman urging Zania Scott to grab the chance with Zach Young for the sake of both herself and her daughter. Yananiel was stunned to see Zania, while Gavin grinned and pointed out that Zach Young also owned a villa in the area. Zania Scott spun around, her eyes wide with shock at the sight of Gavin standing there. She flew into a rage, jabbing a finger at Gavin's face and screaming that he was stalking her. Zania's mother jumped in, calling Gavin a broke, hopeless lover who didn't deserve her daughter at all. She kept on shouting, promising to tell the school and call the police so they could throw both Gavin and Yaniel in jail. Gavin just rolled his eyes and retorted, asking how her business had anything to do with him renting a house there. Zania folded her arms and sneered, making fun of the idea that someone with only a few hundred yuan for living expenses could ever afford the rent here. Just then, the female agent came back beaming and said everything was sorted with a monthly rent of 25,000. Zania's mother froze, her mouth hanging open in shock at the words she had just heard. After shaking off the shock, Zia Scott crossed her arms and laughed it off, claiming Gavin rented the villa just because he was too desperate to miss her. Gavin just sneered at her crazy idea, while Yaniel, standing right beside him, had a shout in shock. Zania's mother yanked her away, sneering that Gavin wasn't even good enough to date her with only 25,000 for rent. Gavin immediately told the agent he'd pay 250,000 to sign the deal right now. Zania and her mother were shocked, and she screamed that Gavin was just pretending and couldn't really have that much money. Without saying another word, Gavin held up his phone with a big smile and announced that the 250,000 had successfully transferred. The agent beamed as he handed the keys to Gavin, and the two of them strolled off casually, leaving Zania and her mother standing there in stunned silence. Zania's mother stood frozen, unsure if they had misjudged Gavin, but Zania snapped, shouting that he was nothing more than an orphan. While traveling, Gavin asked Yaniel if he knew who ran the city's biggest interior design firm, and his friend said yes. Gavin jumped right in and asked Yaniel to set up a meeting to fix up the villa, which only made Yaniel even more puzzled by his friend's weird idea. Gavin gave a mysterious smile, gently told Yaniel to stop asking so many questions, set up their meeting, and promised that everything would make sense by tonight. Soon after, Yaniel beamed with joy, saying his dad had used his pull to make the owner of Heaven's Rainbow wait and meet Gavin alone. Gavin happily declared he'd bring a truckload of instant noodles as a thank you gift, which made Yananiel panic and shout that his dad never eats junk food. Gavin smiled with surety, promising that soon Yananiel's father would be singing praises about his gift. They rushed up to the big, open office of the interior design firm, Heaven's Rainbow Decor. While Zania's mother urged her to work hard, she reminded her that Zach Young was footing the bill for the renovation. Right as Gavin and Yananiel stepped through the door, the woman at the desk stood up to check for an appointment, and that made Zania, who was standing right there, turn around to look. The moment Zania spotted Gavin, she immediately called him shameless for following her right up to the interior design company. Gavin sighed tiredly, wondering why fate kept making him run into that silly mother and daughter pair. Yanel Parker couldn't believe his ears when Zania Scott sneaked in to mock Gavin for trying to renovate a home that wasn't even his. Gavin Clark totally ignored her and shouted to the receptionist that he had an appointment. Zania's mom and daughter eyed him with suspicion, convinced he was just putting on a show to look wealthier than he really was. Just then, a man the receptionist politely called Mr. J.O. strolled in to ask about his appointment. The receptionist quickly pointed out where Gavin and Zania's mom and daughter were standing. Zania's mother was instantly overjoyed, secretly amazed that Zach Young had managed to invite Mr. Shao of Heaven's Rainbow to meet them. She turned and mocked Gavin, gloating that her daughter was meeting the boss while he was just forced to stand and wait. Thinking she was right, Zania quickly walked up to give Mr. Shao a warm hello. Mr. Shao looked puzzled and asked blankly if she had an appointment with him. Zania stood tall and declared with certainty that she was the one who set up the appointment. Mr. Shao frowned and asked if her name was Gavin Clark, which made Zania freeze up before quickly shaking her head and giving her real name instead. As soon as he heard this, Mr. Shao shoved Zania away and coldly told her not to get involved in other people's problems. Only then did Gavin Clark smile, step forward, and introduce himself. Mr. Shao was shocked by how young Gavin looked and happily invited him inside to talk, leaving Zania and her mother staring in disbelief. Unable to believe the truth, Zania angrily blamed Yanel Parker's family ties, especially since Gavin couldn't possibly have that kind of power, before the door to the director's office swung shut on them. Inside, Mr. Shao warmly asked Gavin which house he wanted to fix up. Gavin smiled with confidence and said that the house he wanted to fix up was a villa. Mr. Shao thought the job was easy, so he listed the basic budget options and offered to work with the design director to fill in the missing details. Gavin Clark stepped up with bold confidence, insisting that Mr. Shao must take on the discussion of this project himself. Mr. Shao sneered that he was too busy to help, saying he only worked on the biggest project himself. Gavin jumped up and insisted this was a huge project, which made Mr. Shao turn around to ask about the budget. He casually said the number was at least 30 million, and while the director was still laughing, Mr. Zhao's smile suddenly froze as the huge amount hit him. He stood frozen in shock, stammering to ask if it was 30 million and not just 3 million. Gavin gave a calm smile and stood his ground on the number of 30 million. The design director hurried over to take charge, but Mr. Shao waved him down and insisted on handling the project himself. Mr. Shao still couldn't believe it, wondering how that much cash could buy a whole new villa instead of just fixing up one. Gavin just handed him a roll of blueprints to look over without saying a word. The moment Mr. Shao saw the blueprints, he was so scared he shouted in disbelief, wondering if Gavin was building a fortress or a bunker. Gavin smirked and said he'd pay whatever it took as long as the job got done in just 2 weeks. Mr. Shao read the specs closely and saw ridiculous demands like a system that could survive minus 90 degrees Celsius and 20 centimeters of steel, so he knew this must be a war bunker built for the end of the world. The young man urged him to believe the end was really here and offered $20 million to pay for it right now. Seeing Gavin's firm resolve, Mr. Zhao agreed to throw every resource the company had at building the safe house in just 2 weeks. On the way home, Yanel Parker couldn't stop shouting that Gavin was insane to spend $35 million fixing up a house they weren't even allowed to keep. Gavin just said that money would soon be worthless, but Yanel still couldn't figure out where he got the $20 million deposit. He casually admitted to taking out a huge high-interest loan, which made Yanel panic and beg him to consider what would happen if the prophecy never came true. Just then, Zania Scott and her mom showed up with a sarcastic grin, mocking Gavin by asking how much he spent on the fixes and calling it a cheap stunt just to get attention. Gavin Clark shot back with a sneer, insisting that his business had absolutely nothing to do with Zania. Zania's mother jumped in to make fun of him, bragging that her daughter had spent $1 million fixing up the house and that she would show him who was truly in charge. Unable to hold back, Yanel Parker shouted that $1 million meant nothing compared to the $35 million Gavin had already spent. Zen and her mom burst out laughing, hooting that it was the silliest brag they'd ever heard. Gavin just grinned with a challenge in his eyes, daring Zania's mom to call him dad if he really spent that much money. Zania was sure Gavin only had $3 million from his house sale, so she warned him not to be foolish and end up broke. With a greedy grin, Zania's mother instantly took the bet, sure she would win. Suddenly, a woman from the design firm rushed up to call Gavin back, reminding him that he had left the contract behind. Zania's mother grabbed the paper and shouted that she would show everyone his lies right away. But when she looked at the name on the contract, her face went pale with fear. Zania still felt smug, challenging her mother to admit how tiny that number really was. The mother shivered and stammered, confirming the shocking number of 35 million. She couldn't believe the truth, so she screamed in panic and insisted the contract was fake. The female receptionist immediately stepped forward with a serious look, confirming that Director Xiao had signed the contract herself and warning that they would face legal action if they kept slandering her. Gavin stepped forward with an icy glare, forcing the woman to keep her word and making her furious that he, a mere child, made her call him dad. Before anyone could react, Gavin lashed out and sent a loud crack echoing across the arrogant woman's face. He and Yaniel turned and walked off, making his friend happy, while Xania rushed to help her shaky mom follow them. Holding her mother, whose face bore a red slap mark, Xenia screamed in fury, vowing she would never forgive Gavin. Then the view changed to a beautiful big house standing quietly under the dark night sky. At the villa, Yaniel Parker stared with a blank look and asked why they had come back. Gavin Clark smirked and promised to convince Yaniel that the end of the world was coming. As Gavin climbed the stairs, Yaniel couldn't help but wonder if his friend was completely crazy or if he actually meant every word. With the summer night biting cold, Yaniel shivered after 2 hours of waiting and threatened to go home to sleep. Gavin lifted his head from his phone, his eyes sharp as he announced that the big moment was coming. Right away, a bright streak of light ripped across the dark sky, and Gavin knew it had arrived. Yaniel still didn't believe it, thinking it was just an ordinary shooting star. Gavin said the real end wasn't for another half a month, but the freezing nights and falling stars were warning signs that something big was coming. Yaniel suddenly froze in terror, jabbing at the sky and screaming that the meteor was coming right for them. Gavin remembered his past life and saw these falling stars as a chance to wake up special powers that had created many strong heroes before. He knew this meteor was the one that had fallen into the abandoned villa, and in his past life, a thief had accidentally picked it up. As a blazing meteor hurtled toward them, Yaniel lunged to grab his friend, screaming in terror and shouting for them to run. With eyes burning with fire, Gavin lunged ahead and shouted that this chance belonged to him alone. Yaniel screamed in panic, begging Gavin to stop his attempt to die. Even with the warning, Gavin stretched his arms wide to catch the power flowing from stars. Yaniel stopped dead in his tracks, horrified that he thought his friend had been turned to dust by the falling meteor. Then Gavin stood tall in a glowing golden light, whispering that his strength had suddenly grown 5 times bigger. He turned around with a confident grin and asked Yaniel if his friend finally believed him. Yaniel Parker stood frozen, stammering in shock as he asked how Gavin could still be alive. Gavin stood bathed in a glowing light and announced that he wasn't dead, had gained a special power, and was now much stronger. Still doubtful, Yaniel pushed his glasses up and couldn't see any change, wondering how Gavin had gotten so strong. Just then, a solid hand landed on Yaniel's shoulder, giving him a real jump. Gavin picked Yaniel up with one hand, while Yaniel screamed in fear, but Gavin said nothing. Gavin grinned and asked if Yaniel finally believed him. Yaniel was terrified to find that even someone as heavy as him could be lifted with just one hand. Yaniel's nightmare went on while Gavin kept him hanging on the roof's edge. Down we go, Gavin said with a look of pure determination, ready to pull off his next wild stunt. He leaped off the building with Yaniel screaming in panic, believing they were both about to die. A loud thud echoed as they both landed safely, with Gavin taking the full force of the crash. Yaniel's eyes snapped open in shock, unable to believe he wasn't hurt at all. "Do you believe me now?" Gavin asked again, and this time Yaniel stammered that he finally believed it after seeing the 10-meter jump land without a single scratch. Inside their fancy house, Xania's mom walked up to her thoughtful daughter by the window and asked what she was staring at. Xania snapped that she watched a meteor crash near Gavin's rental, which made her mother hiss that it should have smashed right onto his head. Xenia sneered, telling her mom that Zach Young was coming back and wouldn't let Gavin go easy on him. Just then, the doorbell rang and cut short the mother and daughter's talk. Zen's mom ran to meet the young master, who asked right away where Xania was. Xania spun around instantly, calling out Zach's name with a look that made his heart race. Zachy Young stepped up, hugged Xania, and patted her bottom, demanding she take a bath right away since he had held himself back for days. Xania's mother nervously tried to get Zachy Young's attention, but he just grumbled and told her to go boil some water. Xenia stepped in to tell Zach that Gavin had just moved into their neighborhood. Hearing this, Zach flew into a rage and roared that he hadn't even searched for Gavin, yet Gavin had the audacity to show up first. Xania's mother just made things worse by claiming Gavin rented the villa on purpose to get close to her daughter and even goading Zach to drive him away. Zach firmly pulled out his phone, promising to call someone who would make Gavin regret ever crossing him. He looked like he wanted to kill everyone, then shouted out to a man named Bao and told him who he was. The call was passed along to a loud and busy boxing gym. In the ring, red-haired boxer Bao was given a break to take a call from young Master Young. Zack grinned and handed Bao a promise of 200,000 to take care of a problem for him. Bao nodded with confidence, promising to finish the job and tell Zack about it within 2 hours. Bao hung up the phone, turned to his opponent, and declared he had business to attend to, wanting to end the match right now. The boxing king roared that rookie Bao was asking for a beating. Before he could speak again, Bao hammered a crushing punch right into his opponent's jaw. The shocked crowd gasped as a rookie knocked out the underground boxing champion with one punch, and they started cheering for the new king's arrival. At the new villa, Gavin stared out into the dark night, quietly thinking about the terrifying beginning of the coming Ice Age disaster. As Yananiel Parker sat with him mourning humanity's cruel fate, Gavin asked if his friend had finally decided his future. Yaniel jumped up right away and promised he'd do whatever Gavin told him to. Gavin calmly told Yananiel to head home and sell his father's belongings. Yaniel tried to explain that even though his dad had money, telling him the world was ending would just make him think he had lost his mind. Gavin Clark warned that in just 2 weeks, money would be useless and only food and supplies would hold any real value. Hearing this, Yaniel Parker decided right then and there to follow his friend's advice, even if it meant facing his angry father, and he rushed home immediately. Suddenly, Gavin's eyes narrowed because he felt something was wrong. He quickly motioned for the confused Yaniel to shut up right away. Gavin peered out and shouted that people were swarming all around the villa. Outside, a group of thugs waited for Bao to give the order to smash down the door and charge inside. A massive man grabbed his sledgehammer and shouted that he was on it. He grinned wickedly and swung the huge hammer at the wooden door. But right as the door burst open, a huge kick threw him and his hammer flying backward. Standing at the door, Gavin asked the strangers who they were while Yaniel hid behind him in fear. Bao was shocked when his target recognized him and asked if Gavin was a real fighter. Gavin smirked, his past life's memories instantly telling him that the leader standing before him was Duan Hubba. Bao stood frozen, confused that a student would know his name. As Gavin thought, memories of Duan Hubba surfaced, the lucky survivor who found power after the end of the world and somehow kept his heart. Bao pointed right at Gavin's face, acting proud and saying Zack Young had sent him to keep Gavin stuck in bed for 6 months. Facing the threat, Gavin just crossed his arms, sneered, and told them to get lost. Filled with rage of being disrespected, Bao let out a roar and charged forward with a mighty punch. Gavin shut his eyes and saw the punch coming so slowly it looked like it would take forever. In a flash, he slipped past the attack, leaving Bao stunned by just how fast his opponent could move. Right after he dodged, Gavin hit Bao hard in the chest with an elbow, sending him flying. The bowing subordinates were shocked to see their boss, the underground boxing champion, beaten so easily, so Bao knelt clutching his chest and gasping for breath, while Gavin coldly asked if he surrendered, but Duan Hubba gritted his teeth and roared that no one had yet been born who could make him submit. Gavin kicked out with all his might, sending Bao crashing to the ground for the second time. While Bao lay flat on the ground, Gavin casually asked again. Even though Bao's body was broken, his spirit refused to give up, and he kept thinking he would never surrender. Gavin smiled, seeing that Bao's stubbornness was just what he needed, and he offered a deal, work for him, and he would find a way to save his sister. Bao was stunned, unable to figure out why a stranger knew his biggest secret. Gavin told the whole story about his sister's hopeless sickness and how he fought in dangerous battles just to earn money for her treatment. His pride snapped like a twig, and Bao looked up with desperate eyes, pleading to know if Gavin could truly save his sister. Gavin stood tall and declared he was the one and only person in the whole world who knew the way, making a bold bet that Bao would trust him. With no other choice, Bao accepted his submission, promising to trust and obey whatever Gavin asked. So Gavin ordered Bao to find Zack Young, beat him until he was bedridden for half a month, and take as much money as possible. His eyes sparked with resolve as he quietly took on the dangerous task. Bao instantly rounded up his men and shouted for them all to follow him. Bao shot back to his doubting underlings that he had to grab every last shred of hope just to rescue his sister. Meanwhile, inside a fancy villa, Zack Young sneaked a thought that Gavin was probably already at the hospital. He hugged Zania Scott, basking in his win, with no idea that the terrible thing he made was right behind him. Just as Zack Young was soaking in the joy of winning, a violent pounding on the door made him jump. Zania's mom stomped outside and yelled at anyone who messed with young Master Young's fun. But as soon as the door swung open, she stopped dead in her tracks, her heart sinking at the sight of the fighter Bao and his tough, unyielding gang. Without saying a word, Bao shoved the woman's arm out of the way and shouted for her to move. Zena's mother tried to save face by loudly scolding Bao for walking in so rudely. Her words earned her a loud slap, and Bao coldly told her to get out. Watching everything unfold, Zach Young still naively asked Bao if the job he'd given him was actually done. The arrogant young master tossed out a reward worth 200,000 as if he were just handing out a small kindness. But instead of taking the cash, Bao suddenly swung a hard punch right into Zach's back. Zach and Xenia were scared, while the young master screamed in panic, not knowing why he was getting hit. Bao didn't answer, but instead coldly pointed at Zach and told his team to grab him. Right away, the beaten thugs lunged forward to rain blows on Zach, who stood up and used the power of the Dragon Corporation to threaten them. Hearing this, Bao waved his men to stop, and the air grew thick with silence. Thinking his threat had worked, Zach knelt on the floor and sneered at Bao for making a huge mistake. Bao just lifted his head with bold defiance and shouted out Boss Clark's cruel command to hang the man and beat him. Zach froze in midair, his face going pale as he cursed and called Bao insane while being lifted up. Pinned down by two bullies, he shouted in panic, begging them to reveal who their Boss Clark was as he dimly realized it might be Gavin. Hung upside down from the ceiling, a desperate Zach admitted he simply didn't have the money. Bao stood with his arms crossed, coldly ordering the hanging Zach Young to hand over 10 million right now. Right after, a success message popped up on the phone screen. While Daniel Parker panicked and begged Gavin Clark to check out the practical training tomorrow, Gavin just shrugged him off and said no. But Gavin's mood shifted instantly the moment Daniel mentioned the place was close to North New City. He grinned, thinking this was the perfect spot to scout, just as his phone started to ring. At the other end of the line, Bao told Gavin that Zach Young had sent 10 million, and Gavin confirmed he had received it before walking past a lottery ticket booth. He suddenly remembered the lottery ticket in his pocket and thought that winning it would let him buy tons of supplies to get ready for whatever comes next. But the result crushed him, leaving Gavin stunned as he quickly blamed a hidden force for stealing his victory instead of accepting that his past life knowledge had somehow failed him. Gavin turned around and kept walking, telling himself he had to find a new way to make a lot of money. At the assembly point for the training session, while other students chattered excitedly, Gavin stood alone in the silent crowd. Out of nowhere, Jolene Little and Sharon Zeller stepped in front of him, with Jolene shouting at him for the nerve to appear there. Gavin just smirked and casually asked why he wouldn't dare. Jolene shouted at Gavin, blaming him for going back on their promise to pay off his 20,000 debt after they both worked hard for a whole month just to cover it. Gavin snapped back with cold anger, saying the mess wasn't his doing. Jolene instantly switched her act, moving closer and speaking sweetly to trick Gavin into paying what he owed her, while promising she'd do anything he asked. Sharon leaned close and whispered that if he handed over 20,000, they wouldn't be heading back to the dorm that night. Gavin smiled and flipped the script, asking the two girls to give him 40,000 right now. Left alone, Sharon Zeller yelled an angry threat at Gavin Clark as he walked away. Right after that, Daniel Parker called out to Gavin, pointing toward his friends with their strangely swollen eyes. Daniel sighed, admitting that his tears failed to convince his father about the coming end of the world. Gavin grinned with a mischievous glint in his eye and curiously asked what happened in that show. Daniel bitterly told how his father didn't even believe him and then beat him hard with an iron rod, making him cry from the real pain. Gavin patted his friend's shoulder to offer comfort, gently reminding him that it takes time to accept such a scary truth. Just then, Instructor Chi Chung Dong shouted to gather everyone on the bus so they could finally leave. As the bus rolled toward training, Gavin and Daniel sat with their classmates. Daniel started complaining about being thirsty again, but Gavin just walked right past his friends grumbling. Just then, a girl named Chickedly handed Gavin a water bottle. Gavin didn't even pause before tossing the water bottle to Yanel, who was desperate for a drink. Cheek saw her chance to talk and softly helped Gavin feel better about his breakup with Xenia. Gavin spoke quietly, saying he wasn't sad at all, but actually felt lucky to see her true self. Seeing this, Cheek offered to lend Gavin her savings, but he politely turned her down because he knew her family was struggling to get by. Daniel leaned in to whisper teasing words about Chewy's clear feelings, only for Gavin to gruffly tell him to shut up. Soon, the bus halted before a sleek new building, exactly where they needed to go. Instructor Chi Chong-dong told the students to step off the bus so they could get ready for their internship tasks. As they waited, the students chatted excitedly about the 3 internship floors, complaining that the first floor was terrible while everyone wanted to be on the third. Amidst the tension, Instructor Chi Chong-dong started reading the list and called Sharon and Jolene up to the 3rd floor for special jobs. Sharon Zeller sneered at Jolene Little, gloating that thanks to Hunter, their spots on the 3rd floor were locked in. Meanwhile, Cheek stood quiet with a look of pure determination, drawing the sharp attention of Sharon and Jolene. Sharon wore a wicked smile as she planned to use Cheek's simple background and lack of powerful friends to make her the perfect victim for their cruel plan. Instructor Chi Chung Dong kept reading the list, shouting out the names of the students who were heading up to the second floor for their internships. Daniel Parker yelled in anger when he saw that his group's names weren't even on the list for the second floor. Instructor Chi Chung Dong spoke with cold anger, declaring that Gavin, Daniel, and Chui would be forced to do their internship on the first floor. Chi Chui bowed her head in sadness, fearing that being at the bottom meant they'd never learn anything. Another group of students started making fun of the trio for being stuck on the first floor, particularly questioning why Yanel was even down there. Gavin Clark stepped up with a tough grin, asking instructor Chi Chung Dong if there was any good reason for that unfair choice. The instructor sneered that it was a joint decision between the school and the company, and when he told Gavin to stop complaining, Gavin just smirked, mocked the idea of fairness, and called the instructor a lying bastard. Chi Chung Dong was so angry at Gavin's rude behavior that he shouted and demanded to kick him out right away. He tried to make it seem fair, arguing that if the young Master Yananiel was sharing the first floor with a kid like Gavin, then there was nothing wrong with it. Yananiel couldn't take it anymore, so he blew up and shouted that Chi Chung Dong had asked for a bribe from his dad, finally showing what he really was. The instructor's face turned pale as he stuttered Yananiel's name in a rage of fury after his secret was exposed. Yananiel held up his phone in victory, shouting that he had the recording to prove it, which instantly shut Chi Chung Dong up. Just then, Wongda stepped forward to criticize Gavin's group for crossing the line. Wongda jabbed a finger straight at them, shouting a scolding about how they'd angered the advisor and disrespected their teachers. Sharon Zeller jumped right in to defend the instructor and scold Gavin's group for being ungrateful, picky, and not deserving of an internship. Facing the criticism, Gavin Clark gave Wongda a cold shove and told him to get lost. Wongda was livid, convinced that Gavin had lost his mind after Zania left him and then acted so disrespectfully toward him. Gavin didn't hesitate. He slammed his fist into the back of Wongda's neck without a word, his anger exploding, and Wongda roared in pain, charging forward to throw a punch right back at him. Gavin caught his opponent's punch with just one hand without any trouble. Wongda was so scared he couldn't believe Gavin had such scary strength. Gavin threw 2 cold punches in a row to tell Wongda to get lost, just like he had said before. Wongda panicked and urgently called to the instructor, screaming that Gavin had lost his mind. Gavin kicked so fast he knocked Wongda right to the ground. Instructor Chi Chung Dong stepped in right away, using his power as a teacher to tell Gavin to stop and say sorry. Gavin spun around and gave the instructor a hard slap, daring him to question who really held the power. As Yananiel Parker watched the scene, he cheered with joy and clapped for his friend's actions. The crowd froze in shock as Chi Chung Dong threatened to kick Gavin out of his program after Gavin punched the teacher and left him with a swollen face. Gavin didn't care at all. After throwing another punch and warning that his head would beat him to death if he kept babbling, he left Wongda and Chi Chung Dong unconscious on the ground and called Yananiel to leave with him. Yananiel turned around nervously to ask Gavin what he planned for Chica. Gavin smiled, turned back, and invited the shy Cheek to join him. While Sharon Zeller and Jolene little stepped toward Chi Chung Dong with a fake offer to look after Chica, the teacher just waved them away, saying he was heading to find the principal to get Gavin kicked out. Sharon and Jolene stepped up to Kiyu Kuei, urging her to come along and warning that hanging out with Gavin would destroy her future. Gavin waved goodbye to Cheek and told her to give him a call the second anything went wrong. Gavin and Yananiel stood side by side, declaring with confidence that it was time to handle their important business. They were heading for the province's biggest warehouse district, a place Yananiel said was overflowing with stuff. Yananiel gasped in shock at Gavin's plan to steal the supplies, but Gavin just gave a smug nod and a mysterious smile, leaving Yananiel feeling dreadfully worried about how they were going to get inside. Gavin saw a sign and a long line of women, so he quickly found a way in. He walked up to the desk and politely asked the men if they were looking for new people to join. But one recruiter said no, insisting they would only hire women. Yananiel didn't know what to do next, but Gavin stayed calm and kept thinking carefully. Gavin hatched a new plan, ordering Yananiel to turn around, track down Chi Kiku, and bring him right here. Meanwhile, in a busy office, Cheek was finally getting started on the job Sharon and Jolene had shown her. Jolene got an urgent call from Hunter saying Mr. Jang needed someone right now, and they had to be a virgin. Now that they knew what they needed to do, Sharon and the others set off to check if Cheek had met the conditions. Both walked up to Cheek's desk, acting friendly and asking about her job. Cheek, totally caught off guard, happily thanked her 2 classmates for all the new things they taught her. Sharon and Jolene wore masks of fake kindness, hiding their dark plans behind sweet smiles while hugging Chica. only to probe with a direct question and get the innocent answer they wanted. Jolene, buzzing with excitement, offered to introduce Chica to a boyfriend. Chica politely said no, insisting she just wanted to work, but Sharon Zeller tried to change her mind by promising a chance at a wealthy boyfriend. Even though Cheek was hesitant, her two fake friends pushed her to go along, insisting it was just a simple meeting. The three stepped into a bright, modern office building. Chewie tried to stay away, but Sharon and Jolene beamed as they arrived, gushing over a man named Jang. Jolene officially brought Chitui forward to meet Mr. Jang, who stood with his back turned to them. Mr. Jang spun around with a sneaky grin, eyeing Chica's innocent look while quietly giving the broker hunter a thumbs up. Sharon Crewey dropped a harsh truth. Mr. Jang was the boyfriend they planned to introduce, leaving Chewie shocked with horror. Mr. Jang, completely satisfied, told Sharon and Jolene to go pick up their 30,000 yuan each. Sharon gave a wicked smile, wished Mr. Jang a good time, and walked away, leaving Cheek clinging desperately for nothing. She was stuck in a room with her predator, and the door slammed shut with a loud crash. Mr. Jang crept up from behind and made a gross promise. More money if she took good care of him. Chikue stepped back in fear, holding up her phone to warn him that she'd call the police if he didn't let her go. The man laughed with disgust, sneering that the security team working here were all his own men. With nowhere left to run, Chica shivered in terror and begged for her life, promising she just wanted to work quietly. Mr. Jang swung his arm in a rage, knocking the phone right out her hand. He stepped closer, growling that once a woman crossed his threshold, no one would ever leave it the same. Just as despair took over, the phone she tossed on the floor suddenly glowed with an incoming call from Gavin. As Gavin walked alongside Yaniel, his phone suddenly started ringing. He was shocked to find the caller was Chica, who answered cheerfully and asked what had happened. While one end of the line was silent, Mr. Jang had angrily smashed the phone to stop all contact. The man walked over with a gross grin, trying to trick Chewie into accepting her doom. Chewie, trapped with nowhere left to run, snatched a heavy potted plant and swung it wildly, choosing to fight for his life rather than give in. The call cut out so quickly that Gavin's smile disappeared, and a bad feeling suddenly washed over him. Seeing Chewie in trouble, he spun around and sprinted right over to save her. In the middle of the fight, Cheek threw every bit of her strength into hurling the heavy potted plant straight at Mr. Jang. He was caught off guard, grabbed his head in pain, and his eyes burned with rage. Without a second's thought, he swung his hand and gave Chica a hard slap that knocked him sprawling. Just then, Gavin and Yaniel reached the door, only to be blocked by a security guard. Yaniel instantly shouted at the guard for blocking a young master's way, leaving the guard completely stunned. Gavin didn't want to waste a second, so he shoved the guard aside with a cold look and stepped right in. He spotted Cheek fast and told Yaniel to rush right up to the third floor. The guard rushed after the boy, begging young Master Jang not to wake his father, who was in the middle of something very important. Gavin spun around with eyes as sharp as knives and dropped a bombshell on the guard. "I am Mr. Jang's father." He was completely lost trying to make sense of such a silly thing coming from a young man. Gavin's eyes glowed with a cold stare that let no one stop him. The guard suddenly realized he was in trouble, so he swung his baton and shouted for help. When the elevator doors slid open on the third floor, a dangerous fight was finally here. Just as they stepped out to chat excitedly about Mr. Jang and Chica having fun, Sharon Zeller and Jolene little froze when Gavin appeared, and Jolene stammered, asking why he was there. Gavin ignored everyone's shock and growled one cold question: "Where is Cheek?" Sharon quickly snapped back into her haughty mood, lifting her chin to demand why an outsider like him thought he could interfere. Gavin's patience snapped, and he asked the question again with eyes so hot they felt like they could burn his opponents to ash. Sharon wouldn't back down, jabbing a finger at Gavin's face and shouting for him to stay out of trouble. Without saying another word, Gavin delivered a thunderous slap that left Sharon stunned and sprawled on the ground, while Jolene screamed in horror at how cruel her friend had become. Before she could even react, Jolene got the same sharp slap that knocked her glasses right off her face. Standing over the two villains on the floor, Gavin asked his question for the third time with no feeling in his voice. Sharon trembled as she pointed to a room and whispered that Chewie was inside with Mr. Jang. Sharon still tried to fix things by threatening Gavin with Mr. Jang's power. Gavin didn't care about the warning and kicked the wooden door so hard it flew apart like glass. As he looked inside, he saw Cheek tied up by Mr. Jang, who was screaming at him to leave while Cheek begged for help. Gavin and Yaniel burst in, with Gavin's deadly anger rising as he demanded the scoundrel let her go. Mr. Jang, sure of his own importance, pointed a finger right at Gavin's face and demanded to know if he had any idea who he was messing with. Before anyone could blink, Gavin grabbed the man's finger just as Mr. Jang's smug grin froze on his face. A terrible crack rang out as Gavin snapped the man's finger without a second thought, while Mr. Jang shrieked in agony and desperately called for security. Gavin kicked Mr. Jang in the face with all his might, growling that a monster like him had to die. Right away, he spun around to help the frightened Cheek and asked worriedly how she was doing. The door flew open and a team of guards rushed in, with their leader waving a baton and shouting to see who was causing the trouble. When Mr. Jang saw the reinforcements, he pointed frantically at Gavin and Yaniel and screamed for the guards to kill them right then. From a distance, Sharon Zeller gloated that Gavin deserved to be beaten to death, while Jolene Little secretly thought this fool had no idea how powerful the person he had provoked was. Suddenly, the security guard was sent flying backward and crashed right into the two girls who were laughing at him. Sharon froze in horror as she saw the whole security team knocked out and lying still down the hall. Gavin marched straight toward Mr. Jang, who was lying on the floor, and stuttered in fear while begging to know what else he needed. Gavin stared with eyes frozen like ice and swore that the man would never think about women again. With that, he kicked Mr. Jang's groin so hard it sounded like bone shattering. Gavin turned his back with a cold heart and kept walking, leaving the man's desperate cries of pain behind him. His red, bloodshot eyes burned with a deadly focus, locked right on the shocked faces of Sharon and Jolene. Both trembled with fear, quickly making excuses that they were classmates and that he couldn't touch women, while Gavin grabbed Jolene's hair and growled their question. Then, after remembering what they'd done to Cheek, he swung his hand and slapped Sharon hard across the face, warning that if they were no longer useful, he would have crippled them both long ago. With that, Gavin, Yaniel, and Cheek walked away, leaving the three villains kneeling on the floor in shame. Sharon scrambled toward Mr. Jang, shouting his name and demanding to call the police right away. But he furiously slapped her across the face, refusing to call the police or take her to the hospital. Furious with anger, Jang Bon stormed into Ziwi Biotech and ordered them to help him kill a child. Walking along the tree-lined road, Cheek kept up with Gavin and Yaniel, quietly thanking the one who had saved her life. Gavin waved off Cheek's thanks, reminded her they were just classmates, and asked what she planned to do next. Cheeki's heart sank as she admitted that without her internship, her future job hopes had turned to dust. When Gavin saw his friends looking utterly hopeless, he made a surprising offer and promised to find her a job. Cheek's face brightened with hope as she happily said yes right away. Right after that, Gavin hurried both of them out to a hiring booth set up at a busy logistics park. Cheek blinked in surprise when Gavin told her for sure that he wanted her to work there. She nervously mentioned that the job wanted a warehouse manager, even though her degree was in finance. Gavin smiled with encouragement, reminding her that every job matters and she could shine wherever she chose to be. The recruiter got impatient, tapped his watch, and pushed them to decide right away. Gavin gently nudged Cheat Sui forward, urging her to register right away, and she quickly did as he asked. Once everything was done, Gavin and Yaniel waved goodbye and promised to come back in just a few days. On the way back, Yaniel chuckled, saying that only a dreamer like Chiyu Akui would take a security guard job when she could have been a finance expert. Gavin smiled with deep meaning and said that her very naivety was the secret that won her this chance. Once all was settled, Gavin gave Yaniel the go-ahead to head back. Suddenly, their steps froze as a cold gun barrel pressed against the back of Gavin's neck with a sharp command, "Don't move," revealing that Gavin and Yaniel were surrounded by men in black suits who turned out to be Mr. Lowe's dangerous subordinates. One of the subordinates announced that the 3 days were over, so now their bodies belonged to Mr. Lowe, who had come to take them for organ harvesting. Yaniel whispered in a panic, unable to understand why Gavin was giving up when he could have easily taken down those 4 men. While his friend worried, Gavin smirked calmly and told him to just follow along because the real show was about to begin. The car pulled up to a lonely building, and a voice shouted for everyone to get out. Yaniel Parker looked around in panic and saw that they had ended up trapped inside a spooky, empty factory way out in the suburbs. The gray-haired bodyguard shoved a gun in Gavin Clark's face, shouting for him to move faster. Gavin's eyes suddenly sparkled with a dark light, showing that he was about to strike. Quick as lightning, he spun around and took the bodyguard's weapon, leaving the guard completely surprised. A gunshot cracked through the air, hitting the bodyguard right between the eyes and taking his life instantly. Gavin stood there in the cold, looking down at the enemy's dead body while the gun barrel still puffed smoke. 3 more guards burst out, guns raised and screaming that he was walking straight to his death. Gavin didn't even pause before blasting the 3 targets down with a flurry of shots. Seeing the scene, Yaniel shouted in shock at his friend's amazing aim, while Gavin calmly threw a gun to him and told him to join the fight. He remembered his past life, where without any special powers, he could only train hard to become a sharpshooter and try to stay alive. Yanel gripped the gun with shaking hands, stuttering that he had no idea how to fire it. Gavin asked if Yanel played shooting games, and Yanel proudly claimed he was a master. Hearing that, Gavin smiled and said to just play it like a real game. They both kept moving forward and found a big cargo truck waiting in the factory's backyard. Yanel froze when he saw the Zwei Biotech logo on the truck, the name of one of the world's biggest biotech giants. Gavin explained that while Zwei Biotech used to be seen as heroes, he now knew they were much more complicated than anyone realized. Suddenly, two guards in camouflage burst through the doorway, shouting loudly to ask who was inside. Two muffled gunshots cracked through the air as Gavin and Yanel fired at the exact same moment, cleanly dropping both guards. Gavin stepped forward, snatched an ID card from a guard, and made sure those folks really worked for Zwei Biotech. A woman from Zwei Biotech was thrilled with the fresh stuff Lo brought her. Lo smiled back, weighing the honor of this partnership, and promised to bring 2 more living goods soon to finish the group of 6. Suddenly, Lo eyes locked on the 2 teens walking toward him, the exact pair he had ordered his men to catch. Lo grinned smugly at Miss Pei and showed her the last 2 survivors, who were still alive, healthy, and bursting with energy. Miss Pei frowned when she spotted the 2 of them with guns and asked Lo what was going on. Lo's face went rigid with shock as Gavin suddenly pointed his gun straight at him, without saying a word. A gunshot rang out as Gavin pulled the trigger with cold, decisive eyes. The bullet hit Lo right in the knee, making him fall and shout for his men to grab their weapons. Gavin stood calm in the middle of the gunfire, and his careful shots took down 4 of Lo's bodyguards all at once. Miss Pei gasped in horror at Gavin's scary aim, while Lo kept screaming in pain and yelling for everyone to rush forward. Gavin tapped Yanel to stay put while he charged into the crowd alone, firing his weapon to take down more enemies. Lo roared in anger, shouting that no one had ever dared to mess with him and telling his men to crush the 2 intruders. Gavin flowed through the air like water, firing 2 guns at once and taking down 3 more guards. The other guards froze in fear when they saw Gavin sprinting atop a container and opened fire to stop him. 2 heavy thuds sounded as 2 bodyguards dropped right in front of Miss Pei, making her jump back. Gavin and Yanel walked slowly across the battlefield full of dead bodies, making Miss Pei shake in fear as she asked what they wanted. With a sharp, icy stare, Gavin aimed his gun and fired back. "That's what I should be asking you. What do you want?" Even though he was hurt, he kept up the act of being arrogant, growling and demanding to know how a kid like Gavin dared to ask about his business. Gavin didn't even pause before firing once more, hitting Lo in the shoulder and instantly killing his pride. Smoke curling from a barrel, Gavin stared right at Lo with a calm but defiant look and said, "Say that again." "I'm listening." Even kneeling with a bleeding shoulder, Lo growled threats at Gavin to show he wasn't afraid. Gavin turned with a cold look, staring at a stunned Yanel Parker and ordering him to kill the man. He kept his eyes locked on his best friend while he said the same thing again, making him face a terrible truth. Furious, Lo pulled out a gun and screamed that anyone who stood in his way would be sent to hell. Obedient to the order, Yanel squeezed his eyes shut, fired in a panic, and a deafening gunshot shattered the air. Lo stood frozen, eyes wide with shock as a bullet hole suddenly opened right in the center of his forehead. Standing over Lo's dead body, Yanel shook with fear while holding the gun, realizing with horror that he had just killed someone. Gavin didn't even look at the dead body, instead turning to the blonde woman and calling the Lo Pei useless when compared to her. To Pei's total surprise, he smirked and arrogantly teased her by saying she could call him dad. Pei's face turned red with anger at the stranger's rude words, but a loud boom silenced her rage as a bullet hit her leg, sending pain shooting through her. Pei held her bleeding side and tried to scare Gavin by reminding him she was a boss at Zwei Biotech. Before she could even finish her warning, another gunshot rang out and shattered her other leg. Gavin glanced down at the woman twisting on the ground and told her he wasn't interested in her empty threats. Completely broken, Pei frantically begged for her life and confessed that she had been supplying live human organs to Zwei Biotech for their experiments. Gavin's face grew stern as he asked what strange experiments they were doing. Pei stammered that he was studying human evolution and biological weapons, begging to let him live so he could lead the way. Even without her lead, Gavin saw a ghost of the war god mantis from his past life and bitterly realized that Zwei Biotech had been doing these cruel tests for years. Pei stood frozen, stunned that he somehow knew about their top-secret plan. While that was happening, Yanel let out a scream of terror as he tore open a crate nearby and found it stuffed with human organs. With his wounds aching and hope fading, Pei begged Gavin to join Zwei Biotech, offering him power and riches if he would just say yes. But her offer was just ignored when a cold gun barrel appeared, and Gavin said no, without any doubt. Facing death, Pei frantically pleaded, insisting she was still valuable. Gavin smirked and curiously asked how else she could be useful. With the gun barrel right against her lips, Pei trembled as she made her last offer, bragging about how good she was at what she did. Her eyes grew wide with horror as she saw the cruel look in Gavin's eyes. The gunshot echoed, and Gavin shot Pei dead without any second thought. He stared down at her lifeless body with cold eyes, sneering that she couldn't even stop one bullet. After searching, Gavin finally found the VIP key card he needed to slip past the guards at Zwei Biotech's main headquarters. 3 days later, Zhang Bachwan snarled into his phone in his fancy office the moment he learned someone had made trouble at Zwei Biotech. He shouted in anger, asking why an investor like him was left out of the loop on such big news. Suddenly, a big man with curly hair stepped in with a scary grin and told Hunter to get rid of the kid Gavin. Hunter smiled and said he already hated Gavin and was going to make his move soon, while Gavin's new home, built tougher than a tank, was almost ready. Director Jiao told Gavin that the inside makeover would be done in just 1 more week. While they were talking, Annie Lu from the Friendly Neighborhood group stopped by to welcome the new neighbor. She eagerly asked Gavin to hop into the neighborhood chat group so they could talk more easily. Once Gavin said yes, Aunt Lu quickly asked for the leftover cardboard boxes from the renovation. Gavin smiled politely to say he didn't need them, but he also quietly said no when she offered to come inside his home. Auntie Lu grabbed the boxes and declared she'd fetch a cart, ignoring Gavin's urgent pleas about the construction. She screamed that Gavin was a miser and tried to rush past him, so he had to hold her back and promised to bring her the boxes next week. Annie Lu waved her hands and shouted that she needed them right now, scared others would sell them first. Gavin lost his patience and growled sharply, staring her down before telling her to get lost. Shocked by Gavin's bold attitude, Aunt Lu pointed at his face and shouted, "Why dare you curse at me?" Gavin gave a cold final warning, promising to show no mercy if she didn't leave right away. As she stormed off in a huff, Annie Lu turned around and shouted threats at Gavin, calling him a rude boy and promising he'd pay the price. The view changed to a fancy room where Zach Young set a suitcase filled with $500,000 on the table and passed it to a one-eyed man called One-Eyed Dragon. The One-Eyed Dragon politely refused, saying that serving young Master Young was the sacred duty of every dragon in the vast group. With a dark look on his face, Zach Young told them to make sure Gavin vanished from this world without leaving a single trace. The One-Eyed Dragon smirked with total confidence, declaring himself a top-notch hitman and promising to make Gavin disappear tonight so thoroughly that Gavin would be like he never existed at all. Zach Young stood still, watching the assassins' backs as they walked away to do their job. He flashed a crazy, smug grin because Gavin had no clue how terrifyingly powerful Zhong really was. As the night grew dark, one of the assassins spoke up while they crept toward the fancy hotel. The guy with the messy hair told the one-eyed boss that Gavin was hanging out in the hotel's fancy top-floor room. One-Eyed Dragon told the group to stay close, keep their eyes open for every move, and make sure the target didn't get away. In the meantime, Gavin lounged back on the couch, feeling great because everything had gone exactly as planned since he came back to life. He smiled with quiet confidence, already thinking about the most important thing that would happen in just 3 days, a moment that would decide whether his whole plan succeeded or failed. Suddenly, his ear twitched and his eyes sharpened when he heard some strange noises coming from outside. Outside the door, the One-Eyed Dragon quietly put his gun to his hip, and every step he took was a step closer to killing someone. Gavin Clark gave a smug grin, figuring the stranger was Zach Young's pawn, and resolved to play a fun little game. Crouched behind the door, he caught their secret plan and gasped as he realized 2 teams of killers were heading toward them at the same time. Meanwhile, down the hall, Hunter marched his team forward, warning them not to get careless because this target wasn't easy to handle. A gray-haired helper sneered, brandishing his ready-made weapon and telling Hunter that they'd finally win this time. Hunter stared coldly and gave a sharp command. Kill the target, cut off an ear, and send it to Mr. Zhang. Gavin grinned with a sneaky look, clicked the switch, and the whole room instantly went pitch black. As soon as the One-Eyed Dragons noticed the lights flickering out, they guessed the target was finally asleep and readied themselves to break in. Just then, Hunter let out a roar and told his men to charge from a different angle at the same time. 2 groups of killers came from opposite directions and crashed into the dark room without seeing each other. One-Eyed Dragon quickly raised his hand to stop, feeling a presence waiting just ahead in the dark. He aimed his gun at the dark shape of Hunter and shouted an order, wrongly believing it was the student he had been chasing. On the other side, Hunter made the same mistake by sneering and challenging the person he wrongly thought was the target. Enraged by the opponent's arrogant attitude, One-Eyed Dragon growled a threat, completely unaware he was speaking to another boss. Hunter roared in anger, convinced the other guy had the wrong lines, and dared to speak them to him. One-Eyed Dragon lost his patience and shouted that the loudmouth standing before him today would surely die. Hunter felt this kid was too arrogant to act like a hunter, so he roared in order to kill him. Almost instantly, the One-Eyed Dragon gave the order for his men to kill the enemy right at the same time. Chaos erupted in the dark as bullets flew everywhere, while two groups of killers shot furiously at each other. The One-Eyed Dragon's helper shrieked in terror, saying the enemy had backup and shouting for everyone to grab their weapons. Hunter's men screamed in fear that their foes had many allies and frantically ordered them to keep shooting. Amidst the echoing gunshots, Gavin Clark smirked to himself, telling those fools to play their own game. And after the battle, One-Eyed Dragon panted against the door, triumphantly declaring he had taken down every enemy. But when the lights flickered on, Hunter lay sprawled on the floor, shocked to see One-Eyed Dragon standing among the dead corpses, wondering what he was doing there. One-Eyed Dragon was shocked to see Hunter Walsh from West City, and they both roared that they had come to kill Gavin. One-Eyed Dragon roared in a fit of rage, screaming that both sides had been fooled and Gavin was long gone. 3 days later, Yaniel Parker hurried over to find Gavin Clark and pressed something into his hands. He shouted that Gavin was kicked out by the instructor Chi Chong Dong for using connections, but Gavin just said a diploma means nothing now that the end of the world is coming. Yaniel stayed angry, unable to tolerate Chi Chong Dong's smug face while he bragged to the whole class group. Gavin smirked with a sly, confident grin, convinced he knew exactly how to handle that teacher. In the group chat, Chi Chong Dong happily shouted that Gavin had been kicked out. Wangda quickly joined in, and even as the teacher kept pushing his buttons, Gavin narrowed his eyes while staring at the mean and taunting words on his phone. Instead of arguing, he just sent a rude finger emoji and called Chi Chong Dong an idiot, which made Chi Chong Dong furious and threateningly warned Gavin that he'd regret it. Without hesitation, Gavin launched a deadly counterattack by sending a long message accusing Chi Chong Dong of having an illicit affair with the principal's wife, detailing exactly where and when they met. Yaniel Parker's jaw dropped in shock at the news, and he immediately rushed to ask Gavin how he knew. Gavin quietly remembered that in his past life, when the world ended and people lost their morals, Chi Chong Dong had once told him every single secret he kept. In the group chat, Chi Chong Dong was panicking so hard that he begged the admin to shut the group down right away and threatened anyone who tried to share the news. Seeing this, Yaniel laughed with joy and said he would share the whole chat on the school forum to reveal the teacher. With that decided, Gavin calmly asked Yaniel to handle the other big tasks, leaving his friend totally confused. Gavin asked Yaniel if his dad still didn't listen to his warnings, and his friend sadly admitted that his father was about to lock him up in a mental hospital. Gavin put his friend's mind at ease, promising that once this big issue was sorted out, he would head off with Yaniel to meet Yaniel's father and clear up everything. As night came down, the two of them stepped into a quiet neighborhood. When Yaniel arrived, he couldn't believe what was happening in this small town and wondered why anyone would think something important could happen here. His friend glanced at the house ahead and noted that it certainly didn't seem like a wealthy family's home. Inside the house, a hand gripped an empty bottle while the drunk, muscular man named Fun Kuei glared with hate at the shivering young person trapped in a rusty iron cage. Even though he was trapped, the captive looked up with pure hatred in his eyes and showed no fear at all. Furious at being defied, Fun Kuei threw the bottle hard against the bars and roared that he would gouge out the person's eyes. He shouted insults, calling the captive a burden and complaining about the small dowry he'd paid, then declared he would sell the house. He grinned wickedly and said he'd sell the person first to buy a few drinks before selling the house. He roughly yanked the person out of the cage by their hair. Funk admitted to killing the victim's mother and warned that anyone who tried to fight back would end up just like her. Filled with despair and rage, the captive sank his teeth into the man's hand. Fun's anger boiled over, and he raised his hand to strike the person down so they could finally be with their mother. A massive boom rang out as the front door flew open and slammed right into Fun Kuei's face. Gavin and Yaniel stood at the door, their eyes freezing cold. Stunned by the surprise attack, Fong Kuei asked who the two strangers were, while Gavin replied with a loaded question, "What do you think?" As his memories flooded back to reveal Fong Kuei, a scoundrel who had gained spatial powers and was once hailed as a national hero. But then the heroic image fell apart to show the cruel truth, as Feng stole the food meant to save people, leaving millions to starve and freeze in the dark. Even so, Fun Kuei's past life ended badly when an ice demon swallowed him and took every last bit of his food and supplies. Back in reality, Gavin stared at the person Fun Quay was pulling by the hair and saw a tiny girl he'd never known before in his past life. Fun Quay puffed his chest out like he thought he was a kidnapper. Then he had the nerve to put a price on the little girl he was hurting. Unable to hold back his anger, Yaniel pointed straight at Fun Quay and shouted that he was a beast. He stressed the insult, claiming Funqua acted worse than an animal. Furious, the thug shouted that a human trafficker like Yaniel had no right to judge him. Yaniel stood his ground and firmly rejected the made-up charges against him. Fong Quay snapped, snatched a bottle of alcohol, and threatened to smash the skull of the young man who dared to defy him. A loud gunshot crashed out, and Fun Quay screamed in agony as a bullet stuck straight into his leg. Yaniel coldly held the smoking gun while Gavin stood beside him, smiling in appreciation of